Hello students, today we will discuss about the features of ethmoid bone. Now when you are reading the ethmoid bone, you have to understand the features before studying the lateral wall of the nose and nasal septum. So whenever we are talking about the nose, this bone become very important because there are so many important terminologies. Those will come in the chapter of your lateral wall of the nose. So let's discuss about the ethmoid bone in detail. So what is ethmoid bone? Now when you will see the bones of the skull, you will realize that this is one of the unpaired bone or a single bone. So it is a single ethmoid bone which is highly complex. Now when you will see the structure, you will realize that it is not very simple in the structure, it is a complex formed, and the ethmoid means the sieve-like structure. Now it possesses a perforated sieve-like plate, and that plate is known as Cribriform plate. Now you know the Cribriform word comes in front of the thigh where you have the Cribriform fascia. In the same way, here you are having the word Cribriform plate, and the Cribriform means the sieve-like structure. Now which you are able to see here when you will have the cranial cavity. In this floor of the anterior cranial fossa, you are having the multiple small perforations or the sieve-like appearance which is known as Cribriform plate. So because of this sieve, the word comes ethmoid. Now where you will find this bone? Now as you will see, the front or norma frontalis, or when you are seeing the face, you will find this bone is present between these two orbits. So these are the two orbits. In between the two orbits, we will have here this bone. Now when you will see the orbits, just medial to the orbit, you are having the presence of ethmoidal air sinuses. Above that, you have the frontal air sinus, and below you will have maxillary air sinus. So this area where you have the ethmoidal air sinus is medial to the orbits, and this is the placement of your ethmoid bone. Now in this diagram also you can see that this is a coronal section where you can see these are the two orbits, and in between the orbits you will find this area where you have this unpaired placement of ethmoid bone. Now where it contributes? Now this bone contributes in the anterior cranial cavity, that is the floor in midline. It is helpful in the formation of nasal cavities, nasal septum and orbits. So what are the different parts of the ethmoid bone? The parts of ethmoid bones are, first is Cribriform plate, second is perpendicular plate, and the third thing is the two lateral rectangular boxes which are known as labyrinths of your ethmoid bone. So when you will see the bone in different bits and pieces, if you will break this into the three part, you will realize that this is the Cribriform plate. Now below the Cribriform plate, you are having a perpendicular plate is going downward, and on both the side of this plate, you are having the two boxes, and these boxes are labyrinth. When you will join all these three, you will get this picture or this image of the bone where you will have the Cribriform plate in the superior aspect. From the midline you will have this plate going downward, and on both the side of the plate you are having the two box-like structures which are known as labyrinth of your ethmoid. Now in this section also you can appreciate this is the Cribriform plate. Now below that you will have the perpendicular plate, and on the both side we are having the two labyrinth of your ethmoid bone. Now what is Cribriform plate? The ethmoid bone is composed of two rectangular boxes, and these boxes shaped like ethmoidal labyrinth, one on each side. So you can see here, this is the one box, this is the another box, and these boxes united superiorly across the midline by perforated sheet. So you have to understand that you are having the two boxes, this is the one box, this is the another box, and their superior aspect is connected to each other by a plate. The remaining part is hang. So here you can appreciate that this is the one box, this is the another box, and the upper part of the box are just connected by this plate is known as cribriform plate. It is a midline part of the superior surface of the ethmoid. So this is the first and important thing where you will find the plate. It is the superior most part. You can see in this diagram, this is the superior surface where you can see it contributes the anterior cranial fossa that we know that it forms in the center part of the anterior cranial cavity. It occupies the ethmoidal notch of the frontal bone. Now this is important because what will happen that these margins of the plate is going to make a joint with the frontal bone. Now here if we will complete this anterior cranial fossa floor, this will become orbital plates of your frontal bone, and below that you are having the two orbits on both the side. So this superior part of the roof of orbit is known as orbital plate of frontal bone, and between the two orbital plate, this midline area where this cribriform plate is going to fit is known as notch, and this notch is for ethmoid bone, so it is known as ethmoidal notch. It separates the nasal cavity below from the cranial cavity. That you can see, this is the nasal cavity below, this is the cranial cavity. These perforations, which are actually known as the cribriform or the sieve-like pattern, is responsible to allow the fibers of olfactory nerve, and it is actually the fibers, those are entering into the olfactory bulb which is present on the base of brain. Now in these two diagrams, if you will see the cribriform plate, you can see here that this portion is the cribriform plate. Now this cribriform plate is present only in the superior aspect, and these are the two boxes or the labyrinth. So the superior surface of the labyrinth is connected to each other by this midline plate is known as cribriform plate, and this plate is having a midline projection is known as crista galli. Now when you will see the 3D image, you can see that this is the border of these two boxes or the labyrinth. Those are going to touch this part of both the side of the cribriform plate, and this part is actually hidden. Why hidden? Because the frontal part, or you can say orbital surface of cranial fossa, anterior cranial fossa, now come on this part, and ultimately what will happen that you cannot appreciate the superior part of these boxes except this cribriform plate in the midline. So when you will see the floor of anterior cranial fossa, my dear friends, you have to understand that till here you are having the orbital plate of frontal bone. So you cannot appreciate this superior surface of your labyrinth of ethmoid bone. Why? Because this superior surface of the boxes is covered by the orbital plate, and these orbital plate margins going to make a joint with the cribriform plate. Clear? Now what is crista galli? Crista galli is a triangular process in the midline of the superior surface of the cribriform plate that you know, and this crista galli give attachment to the anterior part of a dural fold, and that dural fold is known as falx cerebri. Anterior to the crista galli, you are having a very small foramen. This foramen is known as foramen cecum, and this foramen cecum allow passage of a emissary vein. Now what about the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone? Now when you will see the perpendicular plate, it is again a single midline structure which is going downward from your lower surface of cribriform plate. Now this descend in the midline and it form the upper part of the median nasal septum. So this will become the question for your exam. When you will see the nasal septum, you can see that this is the cribriform plate. From the plate you can see that a midline structure is going down, and this down midline structure is known as perpendicular plate. But the dear students, you have to understand that this plate is not going to form complete part of the median septum. It is present only into the upper portion of the nasal septum. So what are the articulation, or which structure articulate with this perpendicular plate? So posteriorly, if you will see the posteriorly, it articulates with the sphenoidal crest on the body of sphenoid bone. Now here you can see that this is the body of sphenoid bone and this part is known as sphenoidal crest. So this perpendicular plate which is coming downward from the your sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone is going downward, and posteriorly this ethmoidal plate is making a joint with the sphenoid bone, and it also making a joint with the vomer bone. So this is the vomer bone. This is the vomer bone. Now here you can see that this posterior part of your perpendicular plate of ethmoid is making a joint with the sphenoid and with the vomer. Now anteriorly it is making a joint with the nasal spine of the frontal bone and with the two crests of nasal bones. So this is your frontal bone and this is the nasal spine of frontal bone, while this is the nasal bone itself. So here what you are able to understand that this anterior part is making a joint with the two bones. One is the frontal bone, another is the nasal bone. Inferiorly you will have this cartilage. This cartilage is known as septal cartilage, and above it is connected with the cribriform plate. So when you will see the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, you have to understand that it is a midline projection below the cribriform plate which is going to form postero-superior part of the nasal septum, and posteriorly it will articulate with the sphenoid bone and your vomer bone, anteriorly with the nasal spine of frontal bone and nasal bone. Now what do you mean by labyrinth of ethmoid bone? Now this is something tricky, and it is very important to understand the labyrinth of ethmoid bone or ethmoidal labyrinth. These are actually a box-like structure, and each labyrinth is composed of two delicate sheet of the bones. One is lateral plate of the bone, another is medial plate of the bone. Now here in this diagram you can see that there are two plates. Now this plate which is visible on this surface is the lateral plate, and the plate which is coming here will become the medial plate. So this is the medial plate, suppose, and here is the lateral plate. Now if you will make a box by joining these two plates, what you will realize, the gap between the two plates is filled by the air sinuses. So you can see that the air cells are present between the two plates. So you have to understand that between the two plates the air cells are present which are known as ethmoidal air sinuses, and this box now considered or labeled as a labyrinth of ethmoid bone or ethmoidal labyrinth. These air cells are divided into the anterior, middle and posterior ethmoidal sinuses. So whenever you are reading the ethmoidal labyrinth, the first and basic thing is ethmoidal labyrinth is nothing but these are the two box-like structure present on both right and left side, and these boxes are connected above in the midline by the cribriform plate, and each box contains the air cell, and air cells are known as ethmoidal sinuses. Now when you will see the image of ethmoidal sinus, you can see that this is the collection of air cells between the two plates of ethmoidal labyrinth. Now here in this diagram you can see that this is your cribriform plate, this is your perpendicular plate. Now you can see that there are two boxes. Now one box is here and another box is here. Now when you will see these two boxes, in between the boxes you are having the spaces. These air spaces are known as sinuses of ethmoid bone, which lies on the medial side of respective orbits. Now what is the important features of the lateral sheet? The lateral sheet of the labyrinth is flat and it is going to form the medial wall of your orbit, and that's why this lateral sheet is also known as orbital plate. Now you have to understand that this is a midline bone, so this side you will have the orbit, in the same way this side you will have the orbit. Now this is your lateral plate. So this lateral plate of the ethmoid making the medial wall of the orbit. So when you will see, suppose this is my right eye, this is the left eye. Now when you will see the right eye from the inner side, you can see that in my right eye, this is your ethmoidal part, and this ethmoidal part is nothing but it is a lateral wall of the labyrinth, and which is known as orbital plate of ethmoidal bone. Now in this diagram you can appreciate more clearly, we have removed the lateral wall of the orbit, and now you can see this is the medial, the whole length of the medial wall. In this whole length of medial wall, this part is actually the ethmoid bone, and this is nothing but it is a lateral plate of labyrinth. Now what about the medial sheet or medial plate? The medial plate is going to form the lateral wall of nose. Now this is the first thing. When you start reading the lateral wall of the nose or nasal cavity, this medial sheet of labyrinth of ethmoid bone become very important. There are few important features which you should able to understand. It is characterized by the two process and is swelling. Now what are these two process? Now the process are nothing but these are the projections which are known as superior and middle nasal conchae, and the swelling is known as ethmoidal bulla. Now in this diagram you can see that this is the one projection, this is the another projections. Now these projections are known as nasal concha, and below the conchas there is a gap which is known as meatus, and there is a swelling is present is known as ethmoidal bulla. So let's see the important concept about these things. Now when you will see the bone, now here you can see again this is your cribriform plate, this is the midline structure. We have already talked about this lateral wall which is making the medial wall of your orbit. Now we will see the medial wall of your labyrinth. So where is the medial wall of labyrinth? This is the medial wall of labyrinth. Now from this medial wall of the labyrinth, when you will see this lateral wall of the nose, you will have the two projections coming from this part. Now these are the superior and superior and middle nasal concha. You have one more projection here in the lower part of the lateral wall. But my dear friends, you have to keep this thing in mind that this is the inferior nasal concha, which is not a projection of ethmoid bone. There are three projections in the lateral wall of the nose: superior, middle and inferior concha. Out of these, superior and middle are part of your ethmoid bone, but the inferior nasal concha is an independent separate bone. So when you will see the superior and middle nasal concha, these are the shelves of the bone. They project across the nasal cavity and they curve downward, ending in a free medial margins. So these are the free margins which turn on the inner side. Now what is ethmoidal bulla? Now ethmoidal bulla is nothing but it is a special feature, and it is a feature of middle meatus. Now what is meatus? Meatus is a gap below the concha. Now you can see that there is a gap. Now here you can see this is a gap. Here you can see this is a gap. So the gap which are covered by the conchas or the spaces are known as meatus. So you will have the superior meatus, you will have the middle meatus, you will have the inferior meatus. Now when you will see the middle meatus, in the middle meatus you will find a swelling. Now where is the swelling? Now this is the swelling. Now this swelling, which is a feature of middle meatus, is known as ethmoidal bulla. So ethmoidal bulla is first a feature of middle meatus lateral wall. Now why this swelling is produced? This bulla is a prominent bulge which is produced by underlying middle ethmoidal air cells or air sinus. So this air sinus, which is known as middle ethmoidal air sinus, produces a bulging, and this bulging is known as ethmoidal bulla. Now this bulla receives the opening of middle ethmoidal air sinus. That means these sinus will open in the middle meatus on this bulla itself. So whenever you are having the term ethmoidal bulla, there are two characteristic features you should always keep in mind. Ethmoidal bulla is a feature of lateral wall of the nose. In lateral wall of the nose, you will find it in the middle meatus. And why it is produced? It is produced by underlying sinus which is known as ethmoidal air sinus. Now, what is uncinate process? Now, this term is again become very important when you are reading the ethmoid bone. Now, this uncinate process is a thin, delicate, irregular shaped bony projection of ethmoidal labyrinth. So, again this is a feature of ethmoidal labyrinth, and you find this again on the lateral wall of the nose. Now, here in this picture, in this image, you can see that there is a process. Now, this process is known as uncinate process. Now, when you are reading the uncinate process, there are two important things which you should understand. First, uncinate process arises from the anterior aspect of ethmoid labyrinth in its inferior part. Now, here you can see this is the anterior aspect. Now, from this anterior aspect, from this inferior part of the anterior aspect, you are having this attachment of the uncinate process. Now, this uncinate process then turns backward. Now, it turns backward in posterior direction. So, after taking origin, the uncinate process is going downward. Now, when it is going downward, it comes below this swelling which is known as ethmoidal bulla. So, now when you will see this structure, now you have to understand that both of them are covered by this shelf that is known as middle nasal concha. So, you have to understand two things here, that there is a uncinate process which is a delicate curved piece of the bone. It is a curved piece of the bone, and its anterior end attached on the anterior surface of your labyrinth. Another important thing is, when it is going back, it is going downward to the swelling, and that swelling it is known as ethmoidal bulla. So, now what will happen? Now, when you will see this section, now in this lateral wall of the nose, what we have done is we have cut the margins of your concha. So, we have cut the margin of middle concha here. Now, you can see that this part, now this part is taking origin and going in posterior direction. So, if you will see this area, now this area particularly is arising from the anterior side and it is going in the posterior direction, and it is rise below this projection or swelling which is known as ethmoidal bulla. So, you have to keep this concept in mind that uncinate process is not an independent bone. Dear students, so many times the students always confuse that is it a independent bone? No, it is a part of the labyrinth. It is coming from the anterior aspect of the labyrinth in its lower part. It is taking a turn posteriorly. It is going below this projection which is known as ethmoidal bulla. So, what will happen? There is a gap created. Now, this gap is, now you can appreciate this gap which is present between the ethmoidal bulla above and uncinate process below is known as hiatus semilunaris. So, what is hiatus semilunaris? Hiatus semilunaris is a characteristic feature of middle meatus, and to see this hiatus semilunaris, you have to cut the bony projection that is known as middle concha. After removing the bony part, you are able to see a gap, and that gap is present between the lower part of bulla and upper margin of uncinate process. So, this is your question for your exam. What is hiatus semilunaris? So, hiatus semilunaris is a gap in the lateral wall of the nose in middle meatus, and it lies between the ethmoidal bulla and uncinate process. So, here you can see this is the gap, and this gap is known as hiatus semilunaris. Clear? Now, in this diagram again, I try to explain this hiatus semilunaris and uncinate process again, which you can see again. We will try to start the uncinate process. So, uncinate process is having attachment on the anterior aspect of our labyrinth, then it will go downward and backward. Now, when it will go downward and backward, it lies below this projection or swelling which is known as bulla ethmoidalis. So, here if we will draw, this is your bulla ethmoidalis, and below the bulla ethmoidalis, this is your uncinate process. So what will happen? There is a gap create, and this gap which is present here is known as hiatus semilunaris. Clear? Now in this coronal section you can again appreciate this. So this is what is your middle concha. Now I told you that this hiatus semilunaris and bulla ethmoidalis are feature of lateral wall of the nose in middle meatus. So where is the middle meatus? This portion is the middle meatus, where you will have this elevation is known as bulla ethmoidalis. Now below the bulla ethmoidalis, this is your gap, and this gap is known as hiatus semilunaris, and below the hiatus semilunaris, this part of the bone is known as uncinate process. So you have to understand that in coronal section it looks like that uncinate process is an independent bone, but it is not like that, because when you will trace its anterior attachment you will reach to this point, that is the antero-inferior aspect of the labyrinth. So what is now, one more terms come here is ethmoidal infundibulum. Now the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris continue upward in a narrow channel, and this part of the hiatus is known as infundibulum. Now here you can see in this diagram that this is the channel which is present here. Now this channel which is here, you can appreciate in this diagram also, this channel starts from this area. Now what is this area? This area is a gap between the bulla and uncinate process, which is termed as hiatus semilunaris. So when this area, if you will see, you will find the opening here, and from this opening a duct is starting or a channel is starting. Now this point of the starting area is known as infundibulum. So what is infundibulum? Infundibulum is the part of your hiatus semilunaris from where a narrow channel starts, and that channel ascend through the your labyrinth and ultimately opens into the frontal sinus. That's why this channel is known as frontonasal duct, which drains the frontal air sinuses. So here you have to understand that what will come here is your frontal sinus. So this is your frontal sinus. Now the frontal sinus are draining into the middle meatus with the help of this channel, and this channel is known as frontonasal duct, and the point from which this duct starts in the hiatus semilunaris is known as infundibulum. Now, so what are the ultimate openings you have seen into the middle meatus? You will find the frontal sinus. So where the frontal sinus opens, now when you will see this hiatus semilunaris, which is a gap between the uncinate process and bulla, in the anterior part of this hiatus semilunaris, you are having the infundibulum, which receives the opening of frontal sinus. Now where you will receive the opening of anterior and middle ethmoidal air sinus, these ethmoidal air sinus opens on this bulla ethmoidalis itself. Then you will have the third opening, that is the largest opening, and this is the maxillary sinus. So maxillary sinus opens into the posterior part of hiatus semilunaris. So whenever you are reading the openings into the middle meatus, which is a covered area and it is covered by a bony projection, is known as middle nasal concha, you have to remember that the frontal sinus opens in the anterior part of this hiatus semilunaris by a duct is known as frontonasal duct, and this area is known as infundibulum, while the posterior part of hiatus receives a large opening, that is of maxillary sinus, while the bulla, which is actually a swelling produced by underlying air sinuses, these underlying air sinus themselves open on the surface of this bulla ethmoidalis. Then so what is the ultimate contribution of ethmoid bone? So in nasal cavity we have seen that it contributes in the roof, lateral wall, medial wall of both the nasal cavity. It contains the ethmoidal air sinuses. It contributes into the nasal septum in the form of perpendicular plate which descend in the midline, and it also contributes in the formation of the medial wall of the orbit, which is known as orbital plate. So in this diagram you can see this is the orbit. This is your lateral wall of the nose, this is your nasal septum, and this is the floor of anterior cranial fossa. So this will become the cribriform plate, this is the perpendicular plate, this is the labyrinth. This labyrinth is having the lateral wall which is forming the medial wall of orbit. This is the medial wall of the labyrinth where you will have the two concas, and between these two plates you are having the collection of air cells or ethmoidal air sinuses. Now there are few important applied aspects. If the cribriform plate get fractured, there is a leakage of the CSF through the nose is known as CSF rhinorrhea. There may be a damage of the olfactory fibers which are passing through the cribriform plate, lead to the anosmia, that is absence of the smell, and if there is a opening occurs in the dura mater, it will lead to the infection, that is meningitis. So at the end of this class, now you are able to understand that what are the specific features of the ethmoid bone. Particularly you should able to understand the labyrinth of the ethmoid bone, why you are having the lateral wall of the nose and labyrinth. There you will find the special features like ethmoidal bulla, like hiatus semilunaris. Now you should able to understand that what is orbital plate of ethmoid bone, what is cribriform plate. So this is all for today's class. Thank you.